What is up, Bat Family? Welcome to a brand new The Batman video. Today, we are finally getting into the Batman Prequel Novel. If you didn't know already, yes, there is a prequel going into the Batman. It covers from when Bruce was 10, going up to a period in his life when he was 17, getting a bit closer to finding his future as the Batman, all the way up until, to be honest, right before the movie. I mean, not like as in days before the movie, but in his somewhat mid to late 20s, as he's really getting into the Gotham project. So this video, if you couldn't tell already, is a super long one. A lot of you do appreciate me getting into the extra nitty gritty details, so that's what I've decided to do with this. I'm not reading out the book word for word. However, there will be quite a bit I will also be reading out and then kind of reflecting upon it. So again, whether you decide to watch this video or kind of listen to it in a podcast format, that's the kind of way you should view it. But either way, with something as cool as this, getting the insight, even though it is, you know, meant to be a short story, like a 2-hour quick read and whatnot, it really does help flesh out the characters and where they're at a lot better than what I thought it would. It gives us the context to some of the characters and how Bruce got into this, what happened to Edward to make him this way, and all things like that, plus referencing some things in the trailers that really pleasantly surprised me as well. Even simple things like the Moroni drug bust, which is only really seen as the framed piece of newspaper clipping in the mayor's office, way back in the original DC Fandom trailer. So before I ramble too much longer, I will be getting into other Batman videos soon. I've got some more TV spots to cover. I want to do another Q&A video to those who are interested in that and have been asking about that. I haven't forgot about them, just been busy recently, but they will come hopefully within the next week. But this story all started off when Bruce is 10. Right at the beginning of the book, it describes how he was living in the mansion until he was 6 years old. And then the Waynes, as we've talked about in many of my breakdown videos, thanks to some of the TV spots showing photos of Wayne Manor being an orphanage with the orphans in a choir and one of them being Edward Nashton. They then donated that manor to Gotham City and then they proceeded to live in Wayne Tower, which, as we know, Bruce, still lives in Wayne Tower during the movie. The beginning pages carry on to describe how Thomas Wayne was running for mayor and how he decided to announce his candidacy at the orphanage. There were reporters, photographers everywhere, hence why I guess there's, photos that we saw on a TV spot with Edward, the little version of Edward just looking at Bruce and the Waynes. And at this moment, Bruce kind of felt like all of the orphans were looking at him. And they weren't in actuality, and there was just mainly one, but he felt like they were all just thinking, oh, look, there's the rich kid who used to live here. However, again, there was just really one boy looking at him, and he was wearing hand-me-downs, these aviator-style glasses, as you're somewhat seeing on screen right now. It is really cool. This is what I really enjoyed about this book. Again, even though it's more aimed at a younger audience, I couldn't help but really geek out and think, my god, it's so cool just having already a picture of this scene we're seeing described in this book, because you can really imagine it and carry that with you in the movie. And I know I'm interjecting right now, but I hope this video helps you kind of imagine that yourself. And Bruce was thinking, literally, why is he staring at me? And he wished that the kid would look away. But then Bruce, this 10-year-old Bruce, felt sorry for the guy living in an orphanage with no parents. And I was just thinking when I saw this, Bruce, yeah, very soon you're going to be in unfortunately, a very similar situation. And even though Bruce didn't feel like smiling, he forced himself to give the kid a smile. But then it says, the kid continues to stare. And he didn't smile back. Damn, Edward. I guess you could say that's Edward being maybe a bit disturbed as a kid, for the longest time, but it's more from the perspective, as we'll get into in a second, with the orphans. They just viewed Bruce. Obviously, they knew the Waynes lived there, and understandably, especially from a child's perspective, you being an orphan, living in an orphanage, and then there's certain assumptions made about another rich kid. There's even little contextual details, somewhat like how if a distant relative sent one of the orphans money, they would be called a Bruce in the orphanage and whatnot. Also, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but hey, have you got a coffee yet or a tea? Because we're going to be here for a while, but maybe you can like the video. Look, I know people ask you to do this all the time, but this would really help me out. And other than that, subscribe, because as I keep saying, even though the Batman's coming out in a few weeks, we've got plenty of videos going on after that, going into the HBO Max shows coverage as the Batverse continues, as well as, to be honest, the sequel movies. So I think I'm going to be here till I'm 87 years old. Now, up next is when Bruce returns home at the age of 17. But to be honest, I do want to just say that my favorite part of this book is probably part 2, when Bruce comes home again, but in his later 20s. I mean, all of this early stuff is very interesting, but I'm going to kind of try and swift my way through it, if that's even a word. But that's when he really starts cottoning on to what he wants to do. But however, here it just goes on to describe, you know, he returns home at 17 from boarding school. We have Alfred. His official title is butler, but the book describes that, you know, he's much more than that. He oversees the household, guides Bruce's education, and handles communication from Wayne Industries. As we've been over in my breakdown videos, Bruce wants nothing to do, really, or cares very little about making money. Alfred, as we know from Matt Reeves and other interviews, said, like, he just, you know, falls asleep, and Alfred's even tried to convince him to go to board meetings, and he may have been to 1 or 2, but again, it just kind of goes to prove the point of how that just rubs it in even harder that he doesn't care about that. But the cool thing at the same time is Alfred really is the man. I kind of feel a bit sorry for him. He's really keeping those wheels turning. Obviously, there is a whole board of people at Wayne Enterprises, but Alfred really is trying to make an effort with Bruce to make him a bit more involved. And it also says, you know, with the skills and intelligence of a former British intelligence officer. I find it interesting here in where I have a bullet point, and this is obvious, but it's just interesting regarding what we've been over with Alfred and Bruce's relationship in the present day in the movies. So it says he has been the closest thing to a parent that Bruce has known since his parents has died. And I the way I just take this is like, oh, isn't that obvious, but well, yes. But again, it's been heavily stressed and emphasized by Andy Serkis or whoever that the relationship between Bruce and Alfred in a movie, if they ever come across each other in the corridor, is kind of a bit cold or icy. It's like they don't really have much of a relationship that much anymore. Whereas in this novel, it seems like it feels like fairly standard Alfred and Bruce. Now, this book, by the way, is, you know, it is a prequel. Like, it is all of that. But the way I take this is that as Bruce gets more into Batman, as the years goes on, he maybe gets a bit more distant, more withdrawn, more obsessed with the Gotham project, so to speak. And that's the way I take it from the descriptions that Andy Serkis has given about their current day relationship. It's not, by the way, like they argue or anything like that. I mean, we've seen it in the trailers. They're like talking to each other, but it's not, you know, what we've always seen, such an intimate Michael Caine kind of Christian Bale somewhat relationship. I just wanted to add that context there, because maybe if you're hearing some of these details, you might be thinking, wait, I thought maybe their relationship was a bit, you know, a bit more distant than that. But again, I think that just happens as Bruce goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And it goes on to say that Bruce gets straight A's. You know, he doesn't really particularly care about any of his subjects, but he just aced them anyway at boarding school. And if anything, he actually preferred working really hard, doing all the homework, and just, you know, putting his nose into books, because it helped him avoid socializing with his classmates. Now, I like these little details that the author included and whatnot, because one thing that is very true about this Robert Pattinson Bruce, and as we see it from the funeral scene, and I know a lot of you might not have watched that funeral scene, and as we know, Bruce Wayne at the time of the Batman movie, and as we'll see him, is such a recluse. He never, ever is spotted to go out. Like he gets the shopping delivered kind of thing, and he only goes out as Batman. Very, 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 very rarely ever seen in public, and that's because he's always in the cave or in his penthouse at Wayne Enterprises. So that funeral scene kind of shows how timid he is, or even the Bat and Cat trailer where mayoral candidate Bella Real is like, Bruce Wayne, he's like, wait, did somebody just say my name? I'm sorry, you know, and he's kind of feeling a bit shy. Here, it just shows how he's somewhat always been a little bit like that, and he'd rather avoid socializing with classmates. And obviously, this is when he's 17, so it only gets a little bit worse and worse and worse in terms of as he gets into Batman, he just makes himself even more separated from any kind of social interaction. Again, just to stress, he's already somewhat like this at 17. Imagine, like, we've still got another 10 plus years to go of development of him not really wanting to be involved with other people. So yeah, it just puts it into a bit of context there. This is where we had Alfred, like, asking him what is he going to do this summer, and he's just like, I really don't know. He doesn't care. about working at his father's company or doing other things that other rich kids would do. He craved some more action, excitement. Then it goes into how he attends a gym and, you know, his father liked to keep in good shape, and that's why there is a gym in Wayne Tower. And I like this detail as well, like he's working his muscles not for bulk, but for lean strength and speed. There you have it, kind of Pattinson haters there, even though, again, I keep endorsing Pattinson's body type as seen in the trailers or whatever, or even if we didn't see him shirtless in the trailers, people were just saying, even with the armor on, he's too skinny because maybe they're just so in alignment with what Batfleck looks like, or, to be fair, as seen in the comics, with how tanky he looks in some iterations. But again, that's just one iteration. There's many iterations of Batman, and I'm going to try and not tangent in this video, but like where there's like agile Batman and lean Batman, and then there's really freaking Dark Knight Returns roided looking Batman. So again, this movie and what Matt Reeves is going for specifically, and Matt Reeves, and I do recommend checking out my interview breakdowns, he does go into this specifically as well with how they wanted to go for more of a working his muscles not for bulk but for lean strength and, you know, speed. And to be honest, that is more up my street for Batman rather than like a really heavy duty one, even though I do at the same time really enjoy those stories as well. Now, I do like this part of the book where Alfred turns up and says, you know, I thought you might like a session in terms of sparring, and it goes into how practicing martial arts one-on-one with Alfred has been quite a thing for him growing up, because during Alfred's time in the British intelligence, he had obviously extensive training in several fighting techniques, you know, from karate, judo to taekwondo. And over the years, Alfred himself, which is really cool, had somewhat formed his own unique method of self-defense and was passing that on to Bruce. So Alfred, just like Batman Earth 1, in this iteration of the Batman, trained Bruce. But that's not the only training he had. I do want to stress that. I think I've seen in several places that Bruce, kind of like Batman Earth 1, was only trained by Alfred. Don't get me wrong, Alfred is responsible for a massive part of Bruce's training in this version of the Batman that we're, you know, seeing in... It's crazy to say, it's just a few weeks' time, but, you know, he does, as we'll get into a bit later, literally travel the world and learn from various different masters. Like, it is stated. Like, you know, I guess it was very handy that he had somewhat several martial art form training through Alfred over years, but then it was further capitalized upon as he borrowed from multiple different masters of their own form of combat. And again, so it not only does pertain to this somewhat Alfred training that we've enjoyed from various different iterations of Batman stories, but it does also pertain to somewhat super traditionalist canon as well. And as a result, you know, of its own form at this part in time, Alfred used to joke about this unique form, calling it Bruce Jitsu, which never really got a good response out of Bruce. But around about this time, Bruce takes the elevator down to the basement of Wayne Tower, and there's this somewhat plain door barely visible in the shadows, and these stone stairs led down to this somewhat cavernous space, and I wonder where or what that could be. But even though at this point in time it's really not called the Batcave, he's 17, but it's what I like so much about this story is the background context is, you know, in a lot of stories, Batman, when he's in his 20s, or whether it's the live action movies, he kind of stumbles upon it. Like, take Nolan's, for example. He deliberately goes there because he wants to find a place, because he's already found his purpose and mission. But they're kind of like reverse engineering it here to the point of where he'd found it in his teenage years, and he'd used it for this kind of getaway place and to help get into all kinds of different things, like work on the muscle car and other cool details that we're about to just get into. But then it constantly evolved into his 20s, and I loved the fact that he had it for like a whole decade before he even properly got to being Batman. Now, Matt Reeves has described this as well, I believe, and I think I spoke about it the other day, but this is when the book describes the background of this particular train stop, if you will, and how the Wayne family had been able to ride their private train car to the building, hop out and climb the stairs to their home. It hadn't been used for decades, but Bruce discovered it when he was 13. So technically, if you think about it, he discovered it even earlier, you know, not around 17, but 13. So he's been like tinkering it down around there for a long time. He had already added his own work lights and made the space his own without really telling anyone, but as we somewhat come to find out later in the book, that Alfred basically knew the whole time, and that's a detail I absolutely love, with how Alfred wanted to somewhat let him believe that it was something he was doing alone the whole time. And with some of the things that Bruce gets up to in the cave and with what he goes out to do in Gotham City as a young man, he thought Alfred would kill him. But again, the detail is that Alfred was aware the whole time. And it's just like picturing Andy Serkis as Alfred. It just, I already get such a great visualization in my head of what that's like. It goes on to explain how, just to start with, he had set up a small lab so he could run small chemistry experiments, randomly mixing chemicals to see what would happen at the beginning. But then as he progressed, he carefully reproduced chemical experiments, even as what you would refer to as a hobbyist, becoming a relatively decent chemist. But then it only went on from there on out. And what I love about this prequel book is that even though, it's not the most, it's still aimed at kids, it still sets up all of these important details that sets up a very competent, world's greatest detective of what we're going to see in the Batman movie. A lot of the other movies didn't necessarily do this. That's something I want to stress in terms of how Batman might have gone to Lucius Fox. The thing that appears at the top of my head is that, fair enough, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's still really cool. It's like in that iteration, he gave a bit of the fear gas compound or whatever to Lucius Fox for him to investigate and get a cure for. But in this iteration, as you'll come to find out, with Bruce looking at the chemical compounds himself and being able to identify this, that, and the other and cross-reference it with what's already out there on the market, he would be able to do or come up with a cure for the fear gas himself, as kind of it would be in the comic books. So again, the Batman we're dealing with what Matt Reeves is forging here, Robert Pattinson's Bruce, is very competent at doing things like that with what maybe Christian Bale would have got Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox to do in that movie. He can do it all himself, and I love that detail and how they're setting it up with how he was a very advanced chemist with how much he tinkered down there on the chemist station, if you will, at just the age of 17. The book also describes things like and how he found the experiments he enjoyed the most were the forensic ones. He even liked solving mysteries of what this gunk or goo would be on a certain bench just for the sake of fun, like what was it actually, but it usually turned out to be something as simple as chewing gum. But chemist stuff aside, he had another project that he was working on, and that was a vintage sports car, a muscle car. And he was, straight to work on improving it. He'd got it the previous year when he got his driving license, and he's been working on it ever since, adjusting it, tuning it, improving it in every kind of way you can imagine. It even points out quite deliberately how he designed his own tool belt so he wouldn't have to keep reaching into his toolbox, but I guess this is looking too into it. But it's like, oh, proto bat utility belt. I mean, I'm joking, but you know what I mean. Little nods there, if you will. And ultimately, the modifications to the car, there was several of them, and it kept going throughout the book. But, it was all designed to increase the speed. He wanted to make the engine growl, as the book puts it. As he goes out for his first test drive, things get a bit interesting. He drove away from the old train stop onto the streets of Gotham City, and after driving a bit recklessly, some cops stop him. They let him off with a warning because he is Bruce Wayne, and it's not necessarily because he's Bruce Wayne, it's because to a rich kid, paying a ticket doesn't mean anything either way. They know it won't really teach him a lesson inherently, so to speak. But one thing that annoyed him, and just like another part in the book that's coming up, he gets a bit pissed off with how people make assumptions about him. And I get like how the cops almost do in a way, but with this and how the cops also mentioned the racetrack and how he went to maybe go to a racetrack to test out his skills and how that would be a best way of proving to himself and how competent he is at, riding this new car of his. He has to be 18, but just like how when they realized who he was, like the cops did, they made jokes about him being like a spoiled rich kid, and he was just ultimately really sick and tired with how people thought they knew him, but they didn't know him at all. Again, like this Bruce, and it does consistently reiterate how he doesn't care about the fortune. And I know that's easy to say because he's still growing up with fortune, but still, the book even goes on to describe how he could have the biggest room if he wanted, specifically pointing out with a game console, the biggest TV, but Bruce actually chose quite a small room, and he didn't need all those things. He liked things being quite, close together and compact. So again, he doesn't care about what he is somewhat inherited. I mean, he obviously cares about the Waynes and his family name and stuff, but You get what I'm trying to say. Now, this is where it occurred to Bruce the problem was being recognized. He thought they should do something about that, find a way to disguise himself when he goes out for one of his night drives. And initially he had chosen, I believe, an army jacket, a black watch cap, and some black work boots. And I believe it even details that for 2 seconds. He even considered a fake beard, which would be, just imagine those drifter shots in the trailer, but yet from the front where Bruce, instead of wearing like a balaclava or something like that, he's just got like a little fake beard there. And as we unfold from this moment, you know, the early Batmobile, if you will, was constantly progressing. He went out for night drives, sometimes would rev at a traffic light, sometimes he would get a response from the other driver and they'd do a little bit of a race, and he felt good when he beat them. Sometimes people would be like, nah, I'm not gonna do that, but they laughed and like, fair enough, man, you do you. But one night he came across a girl who gestured him to pull over, and she liked his car, asked him about the custom work and stuff, and introduced herself as Dex, also known as Dorothy Alexandra. Now, Bruce had never really thought about, shit, what do I call myself? So he just came out with the word Paul, because he obviously doesn't want to introduce himself as Bruce Wayne. Even though everyone does recognize him normally, and even she almost does later on, he's still somewhat unrecognizable enough in this early drifter mode. And, you know, the black watch cap is actually a beanie. So it's just almost slightly unrecognizable enough to not quite register Bruce Wayne at this point in time. He also kind of low-key started to like her. The book somewhat heavily hints that, with how he didn't know what to say to her, and when he was with her, things just flew out of his head. So I'm not gonna lie, it'd be somewhat cool if they somehow brought Dex in a future movie, but I don't think they will. They really won't. I'd be blown away if they did that, but it's just something nice to think about, and how she's probably out there somewhere, especially with what we're going to get into in several minutes' time. This is where we pick up with Edward at this age, and he says the boy in the choir is now attending high school. He still wore the aviator-style glasses at this point, which I think is, yeah, I mean, he did change glasses by the time of the movie. They're definitely not aviator ones. I think in the movie they're more those kind of see-through glasses. But the interesting thing that I really like about Edward here is he's a very, very intelligent man, as we know, to design all these puzzles and riddles, but he barely advanced in the next grade. He wasn't interested in school, and it goes on to say that he barely graduated high school later on, even at the bottom of his class. But again, there's just so much nuance to Edward that makes you feel a lot of empathy for him, for certain situations, with how he's like bullied as an orphan and all kinds of things. And they called him Ed Weird and things like that. He just kind of burrowed into his puzzles so much, and I love the detail and examples they give that I'm going to mention in a second. But he just didn't care about the academic side of things. I'm sure he was capable, but maybe through how much of a hard time he had at school, that's why it obviously impacted his grades. It's kind of needless to say. I don't need to explain this to everyone how that can do that. But that doesn't mean he isn't smart just because he was at the bottom of his class and things like that. He's a very, very smart man. But they also add such an interesting layer to Edward Nashton, where he is very socially awkward, and that's what we're about to get into here. So, as it goes on to say, the only thing that did interest him was puzzles. He always carried crosswords or other puzzles, working on them with a study pencil when he got the chance, even trying to make his own puzzles when he was in high school. Around about this time, though, in high school, he was delivering food, and this is the part where it kind of really gets into how he is a bit socially awkward with the way, and it's not like sarcasm, it's just the way he views certain people's questions. There's a bit of a disconnect that he doesn't quite register what they're saying, and it comes across in ways like this. You know, he wouldn't understand this particular question when this lady at the desk of the orphanage, when he needed to sign out to deliver food, she'd be asking him what job he had, or like delivering food for whom, and he would just be like, people. Then she was obviously just kind of like, I mean, what restaurant do you work for? So that's just like one example. But then if she asked specifically where he was going, he just then was, again, not in a sarcastic way, he was thinking in his head, as he was doing the sign out sheet, I don't understand why she's asking. He'd reply, it's on the sheet. But normally, even though you might be doing that at a desk with somebody before you go out somewhere, you'd be like, oh yeah, I'm going over here. You wouldn't be like, it's on the sheet. Like, I mean, you could, but you get what I'm saying. And later on, like with anagrams that he'd come up with a customer, he told one of them, here's a lasagna, Mr. Alexander. Did you know that your name is an anagram of axe and elder? And this disturbed the guy, and he just shut the door in his face. Like, he was always thinking or just kind of saying things that maybe people would have a little bit of self-awareness of. You might come across a certain way and things like that. So basically, Edward where, you know, it felt even more shut out by people or situations in moments like this. There's also really cool bits of context, like when he turned around to leave after doing that sign out bit I was just mentioning. There's a framed picture on the wall of Thomas Wayne and Martha with Bruce standing in front of the orphanage choir on the day he announced that he was running for mayor. So again, that moment that we've broken down in those trailers where we see the photo, and he saw himself in the choir, and this is quite important, this part of what he kind of thinks about Bruce. And again, we've kind of gone back and forth here on if the Riddler really knows who Bruce Wayne is, or Batman, should I say. I go back and forth on it because the parts in the trailer could really be cut together, as we know plenty of trailers do, to make it seem like those conversations where he's saying you're a part of this too could just be the Riddler talking to Bruce Wayne, because there's certain situations where Bruce Wayne is one of his next targets in the movie, as we know. Like, on top of the mayor, the commissioner Pete Savage, Bruce Wayne is one of them, and this book certainly gets into why he would target him by the time, like 10 plus years later, of the Batman movie, of which we're about to watch. Like, for example, this, because then he saw the famous son, Bruce Wayne. He looked right at me that day, he was thinking. He smirked at me. But as we know, earlier, just to interject here, like, Bruce was genuinely smiling at him because he felt sorry. But this is the way little Ed kind of viewed it. And he thought he was so much better than me. He'd never met Bruce Wayne, but he saw his last name on the orphanage sign every day. Born so lucky, all that money. Probably didn't appreciate being rich since he'd been rich all his life. Never knew anything different. So you see the kind of man that he's being formulated into. Like, again, villains are never somewhat just born. This man felt invisible, shoved out, bullied, so it kind of impacted his view. He withheld a bit of anger and frustration about things. He's an orphan. He's also in like quite a hard scenario. Even in the orphanage, he's bloody bullied by the other orphans. He had to work really hard for money. Some of the other orphans got distant relatives sending them money to save up for college tuition. You know, after high school, he planned to study forensic accounting because it sounded like solving puzzles, but again, that's a lot of money to save up for that tuition. And he was also hoping that the people in something like doing that wouldn't be like the high school students, that maybe they would leave him alone. Just little words like that kind of make you feel sorry for him, and how obviously he could have ended up being quite a different person if things didn't go the way they did for him. But regardless, as he went on to deliver food, he continues to think about Bruce Wayne. Like, he's not spending all summer delivering food, and just the very thought of Bruce Wayne made him angry. So just, you know, thinking to those moments where we had the Riddler in the funeral scene, standing up in the, you know, upper balcony of the cathedral, staring at Bruce Wayne. You can only imagine now what he was thinking. And again, he might not know that he is actually Batman, funnily enough. But at the very least, if he doesn't know that, you can at least start to understand why he was one of his targets in the movie. One of his next victims, like, you know, Pete Savage, Gil Colson, etc. But there's even more reason for it as we get in, because what we see with this, I guess, 17-year-old Edward Nashton is that, unfortunately, some of the things after being pushed to a certain point of where he's at, of what we're talking about at this point in the book, causes him to do something pretty messed up because it makes him feel good. He feels like he's starting to take power back again. And you could call that tropey in a sense, with how, oh, kid gets bullied, or this, that, and the other, all of these elements that forge a person, but sometimes that is what there is to it. And it is exactly what forges Edward to do what he does. Again, some details that I thought some of you would appreciate, just like as Edward would ride throughout the city on his job, he would see street signs, customer names, turning them into puzzles, thinking of rhymes and anagrams, scrambled words and phrases using the same letters. Doing this had become such a mental habit for Edward that he did it automatically. Like, he couldn't deliver an order of rigatoni without thinking of a guy called Tony driving a rig. Like, that's how this guy's brain just constantly operates. And maybe some people might view this as contrived, but, you know, sometimes things in movies do, I'm not trying to make excuses, but, like, main characters somewhat it happens to interact with, like, Edward. So what I mean by this is, in that moment, it's not like Bruce specifically interacts with Edward, but as we were getting along with the street races and how Bruce was turning up to that with Dex and stuff, at this moment, Edward got almost killed, like thrown off of his bike, because there was a street race going through town, and man, Edward was pissed. Absolutely pissed. As you would be, by the way, as you would be, but the way he reacts isn't normal. And it also really informs why he goes about exposing Gotham in the way he does in the movie, trying to say, but this person's corrupt, and that's never as simple as that. That's not going to get the job done, is it? I'm not saying you should do what the Riddler does in the movie, but again, here it foreshadows that mentality of why he will go on to do what he does, because doing it or telling the cops will not be the way that's effective. So after he falls off his bike, you have the cars tearing down the street. He felt invisible. He always felt invisible. And he followed them and observed the racers, watching them just growing angrier, and how these kids had everything. Why would they risk their lives doing stupid things like this? They could race because they were born with money, with the system on their side as well, because obviously Edward just, is quite literally in the system. The street race also just stood for everything he hated about rich kids, their smug superiority and entitlement. And as he rode away, he just kind of wondered, and after obviously all the extent of bullying he had got at this point, he just kind of wondered what he could do, or what if he could somehow sabotage their race, ruin it, make them regret doing this. And how obviously not only that they're breaking the law. So he could just call the cops, he thought. But, that didn't seem satisfying somehow. And this is the interesting thing, because there's a certain part where a boy or a kid turns from innocent to starting to think, I want to do something satisfying, to then starting to do something sadistic, almost. But again, it's not just straight up sadism for sadism's sake, like, I want to hurt this person and feel good about it. It's doing that because he feels powerful after feeling so powerless and invisible, so to speak. So again, he considers calling the cops, but they probably wouldn't listen to him anyway. And that's what I was referencing just a few moments ago. He's not going to go for a very long, decade-plus effort to try and expose the corruption of Gotham the right way. That's why he fast-tracks it through doing what he does. He thought lots of angry thoughts in his life, and he'd wished some terrible things on some people who had teased him or pushed him around, but still, he'd never done really anything that bad. But now, just the thought of doing something wrong, even doing something dangerously criminal, thrilled him. So this was obviously a turning point for Edward. Now we go back to Bruce, continuing along the race route. He eventually got in after, initially they were kind of like, I don't know, this is getting sus enough, there's too many of us, the cops might be onto us, but he gets in basically. But we have Edward watching from a dark alley across the street, waiting for them to walk away from their souped up cars so he could put his plan into action. And I love the interesting descriptions, once again, that the book gets into in this moment when he's in the alley, because he's finally doing something about the way he's been feeling this whole time. As a result of that, for once, and this is obviously only encourages him to go down this path as we're about to get into, because it gets worse from here, he felt strangely calm and focused, like he was right where he ought to be, doing just what he ought to be doing. It made him powerful. So it only makes you feel like when he's doing the stuff in the movie, he feels like he's doing exactly what he needs to do, and let alone how powerful that probably makes him feel. So as a result, he waited for the drivers to, get all their instructions, go away from their cars, and he approached a black muscle car with a supercharger sticking out of the hood, reached his hand in his pockets, and pulled out something that he had specially prepared. And even when I was reading it, I was like, is this Bruce's car? And I'm glad they didn't choose that to be Bruce's car, because I thought if you do choose that to be Bruce's car, then that's a bit too on the nose with how these characters are so kind of interlinked without realizing it in the past. So no, it's not Bruce's black muscle car. Now I found this part interesting. So the race route, it describes in how it's through the Bowery and then through the financial district, past Arkham Asylum, and then the Iceberg Fish Company and around Robinson Park. But in the movie, Arkham Asylum isn't Arkham Asylum, it's called Arkham State Hospital, like the Joker movie. And no, that doesn't mean they're linked. It's just, Arkham State Hospital. But the way I viewed that is that somewhere down the line, maybe through Bruce's, or should I say Batman's, collaborative efforts with putting criminals away, it becomes an asylum, like Arkham Asylum, rather than just straight up Arkham State Hospital, as for example, like the little jumpsuit that the Riddler's wearing in the trailers literally says Arkham State Hospital on it. So I think this doesn't mean this book isn't canon or anything, like it's still a prequel novel, but I think this was a little bit of like a newbie oversight, nothing too deep to read into. I think maybe when writing this, the author might have been like, Arkham Asylum, I could be wrong, by the way, maybe it was called Arkham Asylum before Arkham State Hospital. I just find that hard to believe, because normally it is Arkham Asylum well into Batman-hood, so to speak. I don't mind it being called Arkham State Hospital at the time of this movie, because as a matter of fact, that's what it is called. It's just, I think it is an oversight because in this book they call it Arkham Asylum. Nothing too deep to read into. I just thought it'd be a cool tidbit to bring up. It is probably meant to be called Arkham State Hospital. It's just, I think the writer called it Arkham Asylum because everyone, even if you're a casual Batman fan, or even just played a video game, knows about Arkham Asylum. But maybe they didn't get the memo about it being actually called Arkham State Hospital in the movie. So just do with that what you will, I suppose. There's nothing big to get into. But anyway, as they were racing, Bruce got into the near lead and Dex was in front of him. She was a really good driver, but then he saw a bit of a flash in the back of Dex's car. So, it was her car that the Riddler, well, not Riddler, but at this point Edward tampered with. And then this flash turned into a flame. It spread quickly. Her engine blew. She hit a wall and she couldn't get out. Bruce kicked down the window, got her out, right as the fuel tank blew up, like to the point of where it singed their hair. So like, it could have all been over more or less with Bruce there and then. So, again, a little bit of a heroic moment saving Dex here. But again, just to kind of put it into context, this is what Edward was willing to do at 17. Like, for all intents and purposes, he was willing to murder someone he didn't know. But again, from his perspective, it's just, as we went over, kind of warranted for him in his mind. But in this moment, something that was really interesting is how Bruce asks if he can take a quick sample from her tailpipe. And so he takes off his beanie, puts it in a tailpipe so he can get a good sample of what it is. And that was around the moment where like Dex was like, hey, do I know you from somewhere kind of thing? And that's where Bruce just is like, I'm glad you're okay, and just drives off. Across the street, Edward, again, this is where it's kind of sad to see because I guess the word is sadism comes into mind when he's just like, Edward watched and he thought, oh, poor little rich kids. Did somebody bust up your racing party? Too bad. I wonder who it could have been. His intention was to kind of maybe even have more damage than just Dex. He was hoping for a pile-up, so to speak. Which, again, it's just like, damn, like that's how far things could have gone. But anyway, next day, Hughes was using the cap and investigating it with his analytical skills and the chemist station, if you will, in the early Batcave, as we went over earlier. He was convinced that somebody had stuck in something explosive into one of the tailpipes, maybe even like a little timer. And the more he thought about that, the more angry it really made him. And we're not just talking like, yeah, obviously it make you angry, but it made him really angry because his anger didn't really go away. He wanted that person responsible to be punished, I guess A, because he cared about Dex, but B, he comes from a place of where he's experienced somebody just getting away with something like the murderer of his parents and whatnot. So when there's moments like this, he's further instilled with, this is a piss take. Like, that person needs to be punished. And they got away with it because she could have died. And again, he's experienced somebody who's got away with something when some people did die. Thomas and Martha Wayne. So again, this is that moment, guys, where we get quite a revelationary thing in this moment because, sometimes the killer of the Waynes is apprehended. But in this point, it says that for the millionth time, he thought about whoever had murdered his parents. Still free, never caught, never punished. So, whoever it was in this live-action iteration of the Batman, forged by Matt Reeves, never been caught. Even up until what we can assume to be in this movie. Like, they're still not caught. So, the reason why I wanted to make a big deal out of this, without going on about it too long, because we've still got quite a ways to go in this video, that could still come into play in the future movies. Like, what could happen if Bruce, this young, very reckless, very impulsive, and borderline, sometimes kind of wants to even kill, but just brings himself back from doing that because he's got a code before he obviously evolves a bit and becomes a little bit less angry. Imagine if he came across the knowledge of who he killed. It could be, for lack of a better example off the top of my head, kind of like after Uncle Ben in the Raimi trilogy, we had Tobey Maguire's Peter just go after that guy, he wanted to kill him. So what I'm trying to invite the thought of in your mind is Matt Reeves could play with this. I'm not saying it might be in the first film, but maybe that could be a good tool to use at some point, if not in the first film, the second or third, because this is quite a psychological journey, this trilogy. Yes, he's going to learn a lot in this first movie, but there still could be room for error in the second and third, where he's still not quite grown into the Batman he will be one day, where he's a bit more dialed down in terms of how reckless he is in this first movie. So again, imagine if he learns, let's just say in this first movie, because I have a bit of a theory with this. Now we know that the killer was never caught, and we know that Thomas Wayne is a part of this too, with the corruption in the city. He was running for mayor while I was talking on the live stream last night, actually. Well, the criminal element of Gotham City always like, well, mayors can always be replaced. So if Thomas Wayne is running for mayor and the criminal underworld roots of Gotham go very, very deep, well, maybe Falcone or even Moroni, whoever, had a bit of a hook in Thomas Wayne. And even though Thomas Wayne was a good man, he still had to make some things, well, maybe even turn a blind eye to something, and maybe he went against it, maybe he whatever, and that caused someone, whether it's Moroni or Falcone, to send or dispatch a simple goon killer after the Waynes, and because of whatever deal or whatever Thomas had in place, maybe to help secure his mayoral candidacy or whatever, it ended up in that. And that could be a revelation in this movie that Bruce learns as well. I'm not saying that is the case. This could be something that doesn't get found out at all in the trilogy, but whether they find the guy responsible or not, it would be interesting if Bruce learned that whoever hired said individual is actually the person who loaded the gun, so to speak, whether that's Falcone or not. But we do know that Thomas Wayne had some kind of, like, I guess, mild relationship or to something else with someone like Carmine. And I can't wait to get into that. We don't quite know, so I don't want to waste too much more time talking about this, how in detail all of that gets, but we know that Thomas Wayne, there's the whole thing of in one of the TV spots where Falcone says to Bruce, you'd be surprised what a good man is capable of. He's literally saying that to Bruce. Who could he be talking about? Thomas Wayne was a good man, but what was he capable of? Maybe he did something in a larger effort to help make Gotham a better place. You might have to get your shoes a bit dirty at the same time, or hands. Why did I say shoes? But you get what I'm saying. But it's so interesting that the murderer of the Waynes is still out there, and I assume still out there during the time of the movie. And what could that mean for the story ahead? And what might Bruce do if he ever came face to face? Around about this time, though, back in the cave after the whole accident thing, he heard some steps behind him, and lo and behold, Alfred was there. So he's like, "This is where you are." And Bruce was obviously kind of shitting himself, thinking, "Oh damn." He already had mentioned, oh, Alfred would kill me if he figured out I was doing illegal street racing and stuff. And he's like, you know about this place? He was like, Bruce, it's my job to know what's going wrong around this household. Again, just having the visual imagery. You know what it's like reading a book or listening to an audiobook. It's something distinctly different from watching a movie, arguably sometimes better even, with your own mind's eye. So seeing Andy Serkis, a younger Pattinson almost, which you can even imagine just watching something like Goblet of Fire, seeing him as Cedric Diggory. Do you know what I mean? You can at least imagine what this is all going on like in your head. So he then was just like, instead of scolding him, he was like, so how was the race last night? Did you win? Again, I love this. I love you, Alfred, in this take. And he says, will you be doing more racing? And it gets into a bit of an educational lecture slightly. He's like, I'm not saying never take risks. As he goes on to Bruce, I know you will. I did in my youth. In a way, life is about taking risks, but I hope you won't mind if I make just one observation. And Bruce was just like, well, at least he's not shouting at me. Yeah, do go tell. Tell me what you're thinking. And he says, you can't get away from what happened to your parents. Neither of us can. And it goes into how Alfred rarely spoke about what happened to, Bruce's parents, knowing how painful the subject was for both of them. But he says, and this is a nice bit of good old Pennyworth wisdom, instead of racing away from that terrible event, I think maybe it's time to start running towards something. And Bruce is like what? And again, very early seeds being planted here for Bruce's running towards the Batman, so to speak, his destiny. And Alfred's like, well, I don't know, that's up to you, a mystery for you to solve. So Alfred had got him thinking about his parents again. It gets into how the killer is still being out there somewhere, free, unpunished. Again, this line of thinking at this part of the book is still out there. Unpunished. These words are being used again and again. It makes him angry. Again, unpunished. This person who almost killed Dex, out there, got away with it, unpunished. But then, along this line of thinking, he remembered what it felt like to pull her out the car, saving her. It was a good feeling, maybe even better than the feeling he got when he sped around another car. Yes, definitely better. So he kind of liked that feeling even more than the racing. So that made him think, well, ideas are now flowing through my brain. And he grabbed a notebook and pen, the notebook that we do know of, that you're seeing on screen right now, and he wrote down a little subject line saying something to run toward, and underlined it. And now this is where we get into part 2, where there's some really, really, really interesting tidbits as to the ball is really going down the mountain. The snowball's getting so much momentum into Batmanhood. So the following year, he graduated from boarding school at the top of his class, and he attended college, and not just college, but colleges. So the book goes on to say, thanks to Wayne Industries, paying for college was no problem. He tried several. He moved on to a different campus whenever he grew bored of one. He kept changing his major, chemistry, physics, biology. Every time he picked a new field to explore, he found out where the best program was and switched to that university. And once or twice, I just love the way they're making this somewhat traditional but original at the same time. He even chose a school a few times based on a single famous professor who taught there. And these colleges were indeed located all over the world. Like, so, you know, he was really getting different types of education, and Bruce just liked traveling to new places and seeing new things, but he always kept coming back to Gotham City because despite all of its problems, it describes the gritty metropolis always tugged at him, calling him home. And this next part is a really cool paragraph as well. It says, building on Bruce Jitsu Alfred had taught him, Bruce studied martial arts from masters in different countries, borrowing moves and tactics from each discipline, becoming a truly dangerous fighter. No matter where he was living, he always found a way to keep strengthening his body. Sometimes he worked out in sleek gyms with gleaming equipment. Sometimes he lifted milk jugs filled with sands. I guess that's when he's in a certain place where there just wasn't such a gleaming gym and he's like, right, damn, I need to just get this. And, you know, this is like one of those moments in the movie where it'd be a montage and we see Bruce kind of grow and montage between different countries, and he's doing this, he's learning from this sensei, this master. I love it. I'm so glad that they not only did Alfred training Earth 1 style, but also pertained to the super traditionalist canon as well. I'm not all about has to be copy and paste. As I always say, it doesn't have to be copy and paste the super traditionalist canon. There can be innovation, and also that comes with adaptation. But they did both here, and that's pretty damn cool. They even dropped in the line, this made me smile, and how women liked him. And he liked them too, but he never stayed in one place long enough to form a lasting relationship. He wasn't even sure if he wanted one. And then this is where, obviously, as he's, you know, this is progressing his mind and age as things are going on. So that idea that we just spoke about with when he was in, like, the Batcave writing down, what, you know, something to strive towards or whatever Alfred said, this is where that is further developed in how a new idea had formed in Bruce's mind. Somehow he could help bring justice in the streets of Gotham City, but he wasn't quite sure how to at this point. Like Alfred said, a mystery to solve, but he just wanted to do that in a more direct way, and he didn't want to use Wayne wealth, the book describes, such as the charities or the like. The Wayne Foundation did plenty of that. This reminds me of the Bella Real comment to him in the funeral, just saying, oh, your parents were all about philanthropy, but you seem to be doing nothing. But, you know, he's still got all of that set up, but I guess she just means Bruce isn't helming any deliberate things or socialite-esque occasions to raise money. But again, I do think he might still capitalize upon that as he grows throughout the movies, trying to, like, see how it's important to do both. He would ponder this as he walked the streets in his somewhat drifter mode, just kind of like Batman Year One, first page, as he's walking throughout there. He felt energized by this idea. There was even one moment as this was happening when he heard someone call for help because a mugger was taking a woman's purse, and acting on instinct, he stuck out his foot. Mugger went flying, but that's when a few people started gathering around and everyone recognized him helping. So it felt good helping a victim. He was like, damn, like, I just can't escape the cold fact that I'm Bruce Wayne, and it's difficult to disguise being a Wayne. And so he was like, well, if I'm going to bring the city's criminals to justice, I need to work alone. And then, you know, along that line of thinking, he thought about what he used to do when he looked, you know, tried to dress up looking like Paul. This is really cool. This next morning, Alfred and Bruce caught the news on their laptops. And Alfred said that, did you see they got Moroni? And, you know, obviously this is referring to the Moroni drug bust, and you're probably seeing on screen right now is featured in the first DC Fandom trailer. So it's really awesome just seeing how they're tying that into this book. And around about this time, this is where Moroni was the kingpin, and Carmine Falcone wasn't even above Moroni at this point. They even described specifically that Salvatore Moroni was the biggest criminal in Gotham City. For years, everyone had known he and his organization was behind most of the crimes committed in the city. Every single time, his lawyers had got him off. And they discussed, hopefully, the charges stick this time. But that's when Alfred is like, yeah, but Falcone is still out there. In the book, interestingly, they pronounce it Falcone, just like the Gotham series does. So I go back and forth, but you always get someone in the comments section saying, you don't pronounce Falcone right. It's Falcone, not Falcone. But it's just like, God damn it, they go either way. It's like Reish Al Ghul, or Raz Al Ghul, or Reish Al Ghul. It's just, you know, I'm just gonna say Falcone. That's when Alfred says, Carmine Falcone, the next kingpin. You knock one down and the next pops up. In Gotham City, the roots of organized crime run deep. So again, it kind of sets, I found this super interesting because it kind of sets how Carmine Falcone was definitely someone of reputation in the criminal underworld, but he then rose up after Moroni to take that place. So it shows you that before Moroni, he wasn't of Moroni's position necessarily. But now, Carmine, well, from this moment onwards, is the top dog up until where we're at in the movie in just a few weeks' time. Now, this much time later, the book describes the old train stop looking pretty similar to how it used to be back in high school. However, he had added a few computers and a few monitors to his workbenches, and the lighting was the same, dim and shadowy, just the way Bruce liked it. So I guess the cave is looking pretty similar to the kind of workbench setups that he has that you're probably seeing on screen. But now something else grabbed his attention. He walked over to an object his size. It was covered by black cloth. He peeled it off, and it was his suit of armor. And this is where it gets into a cool description of what the bat suit is actually like. The black material resembled metal plates that had been riveted together like a hull of a ship, but it wasn't stiff like iron or steel. It was flexible, so Bruce could still move in it, executing the martial arts moves he had mastered over the years. It then goes in to say that specifically that it was made out of experimental high-tech material unavailable to commercial manufacturers, so that's good to know. Like, you know, they're still utilizing Wayne Enterprise tech that just isn't really something you can get. Like, if you wanted to buy a bulletproof vest yourself, where you can't get this level stuff. Designed to fit his body perfectly. It also hangs on an old form once used by a professional tailor. Even though this is already here, they get into a little bit of a backstory part and where he rang up the appropriate department in Wayne Industries because he realized that he knew his father's company could get him access to the advanced materials he needed. And the guy's just like, this was a bit of a funny moment in the book. Nobody believes that Bruce Wayne is calling, so he doesn't believe him, and then he's so profusely apologetic when he realizes that the ID does match on screen. But he says, any particular research department you want to know about? And Bruce just said, no, I'm taking a general interest, because he was being careful to make sure that nothing kind of went back to him. So he wanted a general overview, even though when he got that, he would specifically look into the research and development side. Because at the end of the day, revealing your desire to learn about the lightweight, flexible, bulletproof materials might lead to a lot of awkward questions. Then the book says, once he got the access that he wanted, I really like this part, exactly what he needed to start building his suit, grabbed a blowtorch, put on a welder's helmet, and went to work. And he had an idea for several features that could give crooks a nice little surprise. Now that is what you're seeing on screen right now, and where we have that goon just thrown up against the side of the wall or whatever, and the taser flips out and he's just constantly tasering his neck. Bruce probably, you know, was kind of low-key enjoying that, but he has to, he probably wants to carry on, but he knows he has to stop because he obviously can't taser someone forever, otherwise they'll have a freaking heart attack. But that is one of the nice little surprises that this book was literally setting up. Now, this is where we get the Bat moment. Now, the Bat moment isn't so, Call of Destiny kind of thing. Everything that Bruce is doing through Batman is already somewhat, how can I say this, been pieced together along the way. And I really like this. The Bat doesn't always have to be this terrifying thing that he puts onto criminals. The evolution here to Batman has clearly been shown, well thought out. It's just this moment, it just occurs to him, hey, maybe I need to intimidate them, and I'm going to use the bat as an idea rather than an experience he has, so to speak. And to be fair, sometimes that's not always even the case in the other things. As I said, that he's scared of a bat. Sometimes a bat just comes through the window. It's like, oh, father, I'll be a bat. You know, as Pattinson even said in an interview, it is a bit ridiculous sometimes the way it comes across. So here, they kind of already have a lot of setup, even from when he's 17, even 13 finding the cave, up until his mid-20s or so, to the point of where the bat is more of a complementary idea that is involved in the whole process, if that makes sense. So late that night, he was still at a train stop, scribbling a quick summary of his progress into his notebook. As he wrote, a bat fluttered past a light clipped to his work table, and he watched a little winged creature fly up to the ceiling and join the others, all hanging upside down. And staring at the bats, Bruce got an idea. Sketching a new design, it wasn't for now, but the thing taking shape on the paper got the wheels turning in his mind. So again, I think we even see those pages in the book that I think you're seeing on screen right now. And personally, I really like that kind of subtle development there, that he hadn't really properly realized what he was going to do. But he's like, okay, I'm going to somehow utilize this somewhat bat symbol in some way. After this moment, it says, in a notebook labeled the Gotham Project, Bruce wrote down, tonight, I'll start I'm ready. And so he stuffed his suit and his gloves in his backpack, wore a deep hood that enveloped his face in shadow, and he tossed in a tube of black camouflage makeup to smear around his eyes. He didn't know, and I really like this bit, he didn't know how criminals would react to his costume, but the possibility seemed good. If they were frightened, that was to his advantage. If they were confused, that was also to his advantage. But if they were amused, that would mean they would underestimate him, also to his advantage. And so, for the first time, he was going on patrol. He got on a motorcycle from the 1960s, and this part's really interesting because it says he rode out of the old train stop. So, as you're seeing on screen, he rode out of there, out into the autumn night, and he passed out of a cemetery and onto the curving road that led into the center of the city. So maybe I was right, kind of. I said ages and ages ago, like, that part in the cemetery, I felt like was on the way to the Batcave. My very early thoughts from like a year and a half or so ago, I was like, maybe the entrance to the old train Batcave like goes down like a Wayne mausoleum or something. But then I thought that's a bit morbid. But clearly, as we see in the trailers, I felt like it's kind of too obvious, like where they're going. I don't think he's just visiting his parents' mausoleum or whatever or anything like that. I thought it was on the way to the Batcave. And as we know, the train stop, you come out of there, you weave your way through the cemetery and out onto a curved road that leads into the city. So that's basically what you should think about that. It seems that the Batcave does go through that well, to get to the Batcave train stop of the Wayne terminus, you have to go through that part. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if you could get to other parts of the city, old train stations or whatever, and maybe that links to the Wayne terminus part as well. But maybe they're all closed off and he does have to go back through the cemetery to get to the Wayne terminus part, you know, as what we just read out here. It then goes on to say, like, as Bruce is finally going out to do his very Batman, not like year one, but Batman day one stuff. It was good to finally begin the mission he spent so long thinking about and training for. He'd never been stronger, and he'd spent thousands of hours perfecting his skills as a fighter. It had been years since Alfred had caught him off guard and slammed him to the mat. So I really like this part. This was like criminal interaction number one. He parked his motorcycle on the side of the street, set out on foot. He figured walking was the best way to kind of spot criminal activity, which is why, as we're going to see in the movie, he continuously walks like around, waiting for something to happen with his backpack because he carries his suit in there, and then he'll dress into it. And in Gotham City, it didn't take long. So here it says, a figure dressed in black pulled up to the jewelry store, and he looked around and spotted no police, just a drifter down the block on the other side of the street. Yeah, man, you have no idea what's coming for you. Now, as that thief's attention and focus was on the store, Bruce took this opportunity to duck into an alley, pull off his backpack, and quickly get changed from his drifter disguise into his protective gear. Now, this is where we get a very Arkham-like gel explosive moment, because this thief pulled out a small container, smeared something on the lock, stepped back, pulled out the remote, detonated the gel, and, you know, got his way into the jewelry store. So yes, it is basically like Arkham Games gel. So that was a really cool way to weave this into here, because basically that gel is being made available to the criminals of Gotham, which is insanely dangerous because it's like a safecracker's dream, as the bomb squad later kind of calls it. And so this is where this thief is in there, starts doing his thing, and this is when a black glove hand gripped his arm, and the thief looked up and couldn't believe what he saw. A tall, imposing man dressed in a black suit of armor. He wore long black gloves and heavy black boots. His face was covered by a mask connected to some kind of hood with sharp, pointed ears at the top. So it's interesting. It's like this bat suit. I don't know. It's like, it was still, for all intents and purposes, the bat suit, but it's like they describe it with the ears, but like with a hood combined. Only his mouth and chin were visible. Drop it, he said in a low voice, and this is where the thief pulled out that gel again, put it on Bruce's glove, pulled out a remote, so that obviously freaked Bruce out because of what he just saw. Bruce managed to quickly pull off the glove in time, but it actually basically completely busted up the glove into pieces. And this glove, as it states right here, the glove was made out of bulletproof material. So whatever the gel substance was, it could clearly do some serious damage. And even just that detail, obviously, like, we know this batsuit is bulletproof as seen in the trailers, but down to the very gloves, that's insane. So it must be some kind of, like, obviously comic booky kind of 1,000 times Kevlar enhanced glove material where even if you've got shot in a hand, sure, that impact would probably shatter a bone, but it won't go through and, like, you know, put a hole in your hand. But it's still nice to know that's how advanced the tech is that isn't available to commercial market that Wayne Enterprises has. So as a result of this, the cops were coming, the alarm was going off, the thief got away because of just what happened. He put the shreds of his gloves into an evidence bag. And this is what I love, by the way. Like, again, I'm not knocking on Bale here. I'm just saying how well this version and iteration that Matt Reeves is doing is utilizing the definitive Batman, because he is the world's greatest detective, and maybe he would have got Lucius Fox to do that in another iteration. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, maybe he's still going to utilize that further along in this trilogy rather than doing everything himself. But here, he looks into those chemical compounds on that glove, back in the chemistry part of his Batcave, all by himself, and he can identify the chemical compounds that he's familiar with, cross-reference it with what's available on the market, and it turns up that nothing matches what he sees there, but he's very competent. He knows what to look for all himself, and that's all I've ever wanted. All this time as well, he's thinking, like, you know, not a bad start. He foiled the robbery, you know, leaving all the jewelry for the police to find. It wasn't a major crime, but at the same time, how did a minor criminal get his hands on such high-tech explosives? You know, it's compact, portable, adhesive, and easily ignited with just such a simple remote control. So obviously he's thinking, I need to stop this before it becomes widely distributed. But Bruce, before that criminal got away, as Batman would, yeah, he got away. But before he did, he slipped a tracking chip into one of his coat pockets, so he knew where that criminal would be going, just in case he needed to, well, as he would, further investigate to get to the bottom of this. So he thought of following the signal, but he didn't know what he was necessarily dealing with. He thought about, you know, calling in an expert from Wayne Industries, because even though he was quite competent himself, maybe someone else would know about these compounds more specifically. But he had all these questions popping in his brain. Maybe, like, do the police already know about this if thieves are using these explosives in Gotham City? He could use some help, and the only person he trusted completely was Alfred. So he went to Alfred, asked if he had any contacts in the GCPD, and I thought, oh, is this like the very foundation of the relationship between Jim and a proto-Batman? But it wasn't. It was actually someone else. Initially, he mentioned that he does have a couple of contacts, maybe even Savage, but that's too high up, the commissioner, that is. But Bruce said he's looking for someone smart, honest, ambitious, and on the rise. Probably a detective. So I was like, oh, Gordon? But no. But it's someone like Gordon almost. But I want to know what happened to her, because he's working with Gordon in the movie, but I want to know what happened to this lady, because she's like a female Gordon for all intents and purposes when you read this book. So Alfred left Bruce a contact per his request and specific needs of Lieutenant, I believe, Janice Durr. Now, later on, it picks up from her perspective, and a sergeant drops off an envelope on her desk from Batman, but not necessarily labeling it as Batman at this point in time. No stamps, no return address. She was intrigued. Basically, he sent her the chemical analyses of everything with some questions attached, like, does the GCPD already know this? Where did it come from? Has it ever been spotted at another crime scene at the very least? And I kind of really like this, because it was like his first newbie relationship between something that you can just see foreshadowing his relationship with Jim Gordon one day, but very mysteriously, you know, liaising with a detective who doesn't know who this vigilante is who sent this in. The bomb squad, when she went and took it to them, she decided to follow up on it, said that whoever did this analysis knows what they're doing. It's impressive, they even say, which is awesome to hear. And they found out that whoever makes it, it's the military, and it's experimental, and it's not available anywhere really. So that means, like, someone would have stolen the formula for the military, manufacturing it themselves, and thus then distributing it to just simple everyday criminals, which is potentially disastrous. So he wanted to find out who was bringing it into Gotham City and selling it to the crooks. So it was time to find that jewelry thief. So this is where we get a little bit of a Batman interrogation. He surprises the thief. The guy's just like, yeah, I got it from my grandmaster, who would then literally raise him up against the wall to the point of where his feet were off the ground. So all of that imagery in your head as you're like seeing this is brilliant. Like a younger Pattinson doing this. Not too young, by the way. He's still quite a lot older at this point. They detail whoever it is wears a mask, but he's just like, maybe you could set up another meet so Bruce could obviously monitor it and then apprehend the supplier. So this is meeting time at this point in the book. So Bruce goes there. He's ready for action in his armor. His car, as it's described, is ready too, even more faster and powerful than it used to be. And the thief was waiting nervously for the supplier. But then the thief, as the supplier turned up, gestured towards the car and basically ratted Bruce in. The supplier took off, and in the pursuit, Bruce felt somewhat of a faint tickle of memory about something familiar of the driver's style. And though the supplier's car was no match to his early Batmobile, I guess you could say, it kept getting away, anticipating his moves. But eventually he saw his chance, apprehended the supplier, and he unmasked who it was, and it was Dex. And he almost said her name. but he didn't do that, but he still loosened his grip, which allowed her to slip away. He went and looked her up because he remembered her full name, Dorothy, or whatever it was, and linked that back to her high school details, and that meant he could find out more about her and how her father's in prison and how she visits him very often. So he actually even went to attend the prison visitation in the drifter mode and even got through himself, but just waited in the local area. This was all thanks to Lieutenant Durr as well, by the way, because she helped use the GCPD to find out some of those details about her father being in prison and whatnot and gave it back to Bruce. But just to put a little bit of a pin in that, the book then gets into kind of not present day, but around about this time day with Edward. Now, it says that ever since the Gotham Street City race, Edward had graduated high school, as we went over earlier, near the bottom of his class, but by now there was barely any room for puzzles in his notebooks under the bed. He'd saved enough from delivering food to do those forensic accountant classes, but once he was certified, as we kind of went over earlier, where he was just a bit, as they say, Ed weird, it took him a while to find a job because he didn't interview well. And the whole process actually took years. But I like the descriptions they give. You know, they say he's living alone in an apartment in the sketchy side of town. He has a beat up car. He has no friends at work. You know, it's just more loneliness for Edward, despite him being older. The next description sets up even more with the movie as well, saying that on the weekends he'd go to garage sales and estate sales collecting old greetings cards. And what does he send to the Batman? One of the greetings cards that he would have picked up at one of these garage sales on the weekends, if you guys remember. I mean, you're probably seeing it on screen, so I love hearing about that in this book. He liked the ones with the corny puns and riddles. No matter how many puzzles he solved and created, he couldn't escape the feeling that life had pushed him aside, leaving him out time and time again. Edward wanted to change that. Around about this time, skimming past some more stuff, he was in his apartment and he started writing down ideas for puzzles, but then he just stopped and remembered what this jerk in the break room at work had said. Basically, a jerk from earlier on in the book. Basically, there's this guy that I skimmed over who kind of just said, why do you do crosswords, and say, what's the point of it? And he was asking himself in this moment, what's the point? He looked at the shelves in his apartment and he was like, well, what is the point? He thought, what was the point in anything? And Martin, that guy who was saying all of this, had called him weird, just like those people back in high school, and it made him flash back to that summer of when he was in high school and he stuffed that neat little explosive into Dex's car, and how it made him feel good that night, doing something wrong and getting away with it, wiping the smiles off those sport brats' faces. So maybe, the book gets into, he could get that feeling back again. So he started opening a new ledger, kind of mirroring Brucey with how he opened the ledger back then and started his new idea, and started writing down ideas. He'd show them the point, show all of them. And sometimes, you know, even at night when Edward couldn't sleep, he drove around the city in his car, thinking about how he might get back that powerful feeling. He had enjoyed doing what he did to Dex. Not that he knew who Dex was, but you get what I'm saying. And he drove down that familiar road to the orphanage that he had avoided for years because he obviously prefers not to think about his time there. But on that night, he parked out front, remembering he hated that place. He suffered there. Seeing the building again, he felt waves of loneliness and anger. Then he got an idea. What if it wasn't there anymore? But clearly, even older now, Edward has got to the point in where he's literally driving around at night when he couldn't sleep, thinking about what he could do, just like what he did to Dex's car. So he's thinking about what he can do bad to get that feeling back again. But obviously, in his own context, he wants to do something that's kind of worth it, kind of in his own skewed mind, want to assert change that he feels like should change maybe, but also do it in a way that also makes him feel good. So for example, that would be taking down the corruption, I suppose, like the mayor, but I guess killing him, and that would make him feel powerful. And as we know, that's exactly what he does. Now, we're somewhat getting to the closing gap of this book, so Bruce hurried along on his motorcycle to follow Dex after the whole prison visitation thing we went over earlier, and he confronts her as, I guess, suit of armor man, because at this point he's not quite called the Batman, but just suit of armor man. And he confronts her about running an illegal operation. She gets into the details of how the operation is being run by Reed Piggy Pacello. He's all thug, and words on the streets is he gets all of his bad ideas from Oswald Cobblepot. Now, this name sounded familiar to Bruce, but he couldn't place it. She says that some people call him the Penguin, and she just basically says, you know, these bad guys seem to have a thing for nicknames, and Penguin, I love this context, is one of Carmine Falcone's upcoming lieutenants. My guess is that he uses Pacello to make sure he doesn't get caught by his bosses sticking his hand too deep in the cookie jar. And essentially Pacello, or Piggy, whatever you want to call him, framed her father, Dex's father, because he's never committed a crime in his life. And he had said to her that if she helped move the jail in Gotham, that he would one day help get his dad released. Now this is when she agrees to somewhat do another stitch-up thing so she would get more gel off Piggy, if you will. So one night they go to an abandoned factory on the edge of Gotham City, and she waited as this truck pulled up next to her with freaking Piggy in there, and Bruce flew the door open, grabbed the driver, throwing him onto the pavement, and he got in the truck to drive off, you know, because there's a whole bunch of evidence there, and this is going to be a way he could maybe drop it off to Detective Durr or whatever. But this is a moment where Batman's career could have arguably ended there and then, because this is where the driver pulls out a remote and points at the truck. So just as he was about to detonate a truck full of explosive gel, which would have exploded Bruce, basically, and Bruce saw that in the rearview mirror, Dex kicked it out of his hand. So again, Bruce almost died in this moment, but obviously I'm fine with that. Still newbie Batman. It's not like he really put together... I mean, maybe he could have had the insight to think, what if he has a remote? But at the same time, completely understandable how he had an oversight there. But luckily, Dex was there to stop that from happening, kicked the remote out of his hand, and then Bruce returned back, knocked the guy out cold, and zip-tied him. There's this one line as well. I don't know whether it's cheesy or really cool. Sometimes the best Batman lines are a mix of the two of them. And that's when Dex asks, like, do you work for the cops? Or maybe it wasn't Dex, I can't remember. But he's like, I work for Gotham City. You know, instead of just saying, like, I'm vengeance or something, he was just like, do you work for the cops? He's like, I work for Gotham City. So this is where Bruce calls up Detective Durr with, you know, the truck, and like, it's like his first proof and everything on this, you know, criminal enterprise with the explosive gel. And he's just like, got a delivery for you out front. And she steps outside. The truck was there. Another envelope, like the paper explaining the situation, including Pacello's involvement and information about a man named Bennett Sterling, you know, which is Dex's father, framed by the thug. So she smiled, satisfied. You know, the book describes this was big. But then at the bottom of the page, I love this detail, she spotted something puzzling. A small, simple drawing of a bat, like his, you know, calling card almost, to just, yeah, and that's like the very foundation of, like, you know, it's like, I'm gonna leave off our little working relationship with my goodbye or signing my name. He didn't sign Batman, but just a little bat symbol. And again, I want to know if she's gonna be in the GCPD series. Like, how cool would that be? Like, I really hope they do that. Like, I know it's going to be probably about a different cop. If you guys know the premise, it's about a cop fighting for the battle of his soul because it's hard to not be corrupt. And it might be him trying to avoid being corrupt. Who knows? But if Detective Durr isn't there, then that would be disappointing. I know they don't always bring characters like this to life that translate between different materials, but considering this prequel novel is a prequel to the story that we're about to watch in the movie, you know, going over many years even, I would like to see her, considering there is an actual GCPD show coming. So, yeah, let me know what you think of that. But meanwhile, this is where we pick up with a very welcome, surprise to me, perspective of Oswald and Falcone. And you can guess who's coming through. Freaking Piggy. Oz Cobblepot opens the door, saying the boss will be with you in a second, Piggy. And he tried, you know, sucking up by saying, you know, the club's doing good tonight. And he told the man was Carmine Falcone. And Falcone, very intimidatingly, just, you know, the whole time, rolling a little, you know, pool ball back and forth, says, I got a question for you. Why shouldn't I take this cue stick and play a dozen games of 9-ball on your thick head? And he more or less confronts him about his side project, you know, the fancy explosive. And Piggy, the goon, if you will, is just like, yeah, if say the word, I'll shut it down tonight. And he's like, too late. More or less, he basically lets him off the hook. He warns him. And I love the kind of relationship between Falcone and Penguin here, because as we know, and this has already been described outside of this book and interviews, that he is working for Falcone. He's somewhat running the club, as we see from the trailers, on behalf of Falcone. He's more in like the shadows. It's all a part of Falcone's enterprise at the end of the day. He is the big guy. But as we know, the Iceberg Lounge is the Penguin's thing traditionally. So as I keep saying, Falcone is clearly going to be out of the picture at one point in time, so that the Iceberg Lounge is not only like, yeah, Penguin's kind of running it, managing it in the movie and things like that, and clearly here they're talking in the Iceberg Lounge, just like this hub for all the crooks and criminals, the larger-than-life people like Falcone and Oswald and the higher-ups. they all kind of talk there and meet there. But it will be his one day. And you can kind of see where I'm going with that. But Falcone continues saying, you know, after what the goon says, yeah, big mistake. And then Oz repeats. This is kind of like the unspoken language that is being given here, and like the gestures and stuff. And Oz replies, yeah, big mistake, agreeing, kind of like repeating what he says. And that's when it says Falcone shot him a look, and the Penguin knew better than to speak again. So like Oz is kind of intimidated by him, and probably hates being made to feel a bit less, even by someone like Falcone. He wouldn't pipe up about it, but when that time comes, whenever, however, Oz in the movie or whatever takes over from Falcone, I think he's going to take a lot of enjoyment stepping into his position of power. Because right now, for example, there's another bit where he's like, some guys, right, boss? Chuckling to enlighten the mood. And that's when it says, he didn't smile back. He stared right into Cobblepot's eyes with a terrible, unknowable blackness. It made Cobblepot swallow hard, wishing he was anywhere but that room. And then that's when Falcone said, some guys indeed, Penguin. And like obviously called him Penguin. At this point in time, Oz hates being called Penguin, so he knew he hated being called that, so he said that. But also saying the line, some guys, he wasn't even on about Piggy anymore. He was probably on about Penguin. Now this next part is the closing part to Ed in the book, and it kind of made me laugh a little bit at the beginning, because meanwhile Ed went to a gas station, wore a green jacket with a floppy hat. That's pretty cool, like, because I wonder if that's gonna somewhat be reminiscent of, you know, the New 52 Riddler. But either way, sunglasses as well, and a white mask that covered his nose and mouth. Sliding a $20 bill towards the cashier, he said he's going to fill his car at pump number 2. Basically, he asked for a plastic can to store some gasoline because he's essentially going to go burn the orphanage down. And he's just like, I'm going to fill this for my lawnmower. But I could, with how awkward he's been made out to be in this book, you can easily envision what Paul Dano would be like in this scene. I felt sad still, though, because there's a little line where it says, and as always, Edward had made zero impression on the cashier. Despite acting weird, despite asking just to fill up a jerry can, it's like you're kind of acting so weird to the point where the cashier would know that you're basically planning on burning something. But that's when everyone at the orphanage was asleep, all the kids, the fire alarm goes off. You know, obviously Edward knows how to do all of this. He's been here before. He doesn't want to kill the kids, which I'm glad to hear about. He wanted to get them out, so he was inside. Very interestingly as well, it says he made his way to the front office. The old photo still hanging on the wall. They'd never dare take down this picture. It's got the great Thomas Wayne in it, their benefactor, their saint, and his beloved son, Bruce. And then the book continues. He took it off, put it on his backpack between sheets of bubble wrap. Very interesting, because that very photo he obviously uses to be the very photo that he scanned or whatever that you're seeing on screen right now, which is super, super, super interesting because, again, it all ties back into the book / vice versa to the movie. So he got to work with the gas. You know, the firefighters got there in time to kind of stop the fire before it burnt down Wayne Manor or the orphanage / the mansion. But the building was a total loss, and no orphan would live there again. But this is the final paragraph, and it basically sets up how he gets into the larger capitalization of his ideas of what he gets into in the movies, leaving riddles behind, doing something grander to change Gotham with how frustrated he is with everything. So it says, Edward, as he looked at the charred remains, he felt vaguely unsatisfied. Because remember, this was all about him wanting to get that feeling back again, and this was a way he could do it, taking back some power from the place that he resented. He enjoyed setting the fire, but no one knew he'd done it. It was good to get away with the crime to avoid getting arrested, but no one had learned anything. No one had gotten his point. Nothing important had really changed in this lousy, corrupt city, and he hadn't got any credit. He was still invisible, a nobody. Then something interesting occurred to Edward. What if I sent riddles with my crimes? So the orphanage is something he wanted to do again and again, but the other crimes and other ideas he's going to get in his head from this moment onwards, like, I'm going to kill the mayor, and I'm going to leave a riddle. This should hopefully change something, and I'm going to get the credit for it, kind of, but through an alias at the least. He doesn't probably want the credit attributed to his name, like Edward Nashton, but at least now he's going to be giddy with leaving, like, a symbol, an insignia behind. As we know, serial killers and other criminals like to read their own coverage and things like that, so what a great last paragraph that sets up the path he is literally walking down, and it's a short path to get to where he's from here to the movie, because he's well on his way. Now, where we leave off with Bruce, kind of, other than the epilogue, is when they're at breakfast. This is all obviously after he delivered Detective Durr the truck, and, you know, she got a big win, and it was his first big win, technically, for, you know, him actually solving this case. And Bruce and Alfred sat in silence, reading the news, and Alfred's like, interesting story here. And he's like, seems most of the credit goes to a Lieutenant Durr. You know, say, isn't that the detective I gave you the name of recently? And Bruce was like, yeah, maybe, yeah. And that's when Alfred cuts the shit, and he's just like, Bruce, I know your project, what you're doing at night, and for what it's worth, I do not approve, but I understand. Gotham City has been in such a decline since your parents died, especially your father. He loved this city, and I guess you do too. Maybe it needs something, or someone, to shake things up. But what you are doing is so dangerous for you, your family's legacy. So it's like a bit of like, I understand what you're doing, Bruce, but like, it's so dangerous. I technically have to say I don't approve, but I do get why you're doing this. Your father loved the city. So I completely agree with Alfred's sentiments there. And as, you know, the context of what we've got through all the interviews, Alfred has kind of gone along with it as we get to the point of the movie, and he's accepted it, but he's still even more concerned for Bruce as the time goes on, by where we pick up in the movie, because as I said earlier, the relationship gets a bit more icy. Bruce just has dissolved even further, so his concern just ever grows, basically. It just gets more and more, even though he is still checking up on him all the time, as we see in the trailers. Like, there's still conversations going on. Bruce has gone from this point where they're reading news together to being like, I don't care what happens to me. Obviously, this book paints it in a slightly more optimistic lens and light than what if this was an adult's novel. They would have probably put a bit more of a coarse dialogue sometimes between Alfred and Bruce. By the way, after Bruce shakes his head after Alfred, it says, is there any way I can talk you out of this? Bruce is thinking, this thing, this project, this course of action, as Alfred puts it, it's what he was going to do. It's what he was going to become. In the closing parts of the book, you know, the Batman, even though he wasn't quite Batman, even though he had bat ears and stuff, met up with Dex. I felt like some of this was a bit sketch, I'm not gonna lie. Almost too close for comfort here, but this is where some suspension of disbelief comes in with comics. I mean, for crying out loud, if you are a Superman fan, the Clark Kent thing, it's just no matter what, you can't include that in writing. It's just, it is what it is. So a similar thing here with how Dex says, you're as good as your word, you know, given the new evidence, the police reopened the case to my father. But she also says a hotshot lawyer from Wayne Industries is doing my father's case pro bono. And we even got a big fat check from some Wayne charity so we can have a fresh start. So in my mind there, considering when Bruce removed his beanie, and I didn't read out the exact lines, I don't think, but she was really starting to recognize him, because he was very, like everyone, even as a 17-year-old Bruce back then, knew that he was a Wayne. Like, he had photos of him in newspapers. They were still reporting on him back then. So, if she put together, like, it is very close, and considering, like, this man is now helping her out, and if she put two and two together of how that was a Wayne back then, Paul was really Bruce Wayne, and do you see what I mean? And how there's a Wayne lawyer for some reason, and how there's a Wayne check. So it is calling it close, but at the same time, I guess it's a bit of the Superman Clark Kent thing, and, you know, that's why I ultimately can't nitpick that too much. This isn't a massive deal to me, because I guess people make a big deal out of this, because it's like, oh my god, they referenced it, but, like, it's not like this universe didn't have Metropolis in it, or things like that, but I guess, like, people still wonder about that, because, like, the Nolan trilogy, even though you could argue it's out there, I can't remember off the top of my head if they ever made deliberate references about it. So with Nolan's trilogy, you could almost argue like Gotham is almost in the real world, and it is like a Batman in the real world as people view it. But here, people were probably thinking, well, so in this universe, does all this exist? Even though we've seen the Halloween party, etc., of citizens dressed up as Superman and Wonder Woman, so it seems like they're probably Easter eggs, but maybe they're already heroes out there, just as Pattinson's Bruce is becoming Batman. I like to believe that line of thinking. But either way, Dex says, maybe me and my dad need to get away. Maybe Metropolis. I hear that LexCorp racing team is taking on new mechanics. So yeah, Metropolis is out there. So in my mind, guys, like, it's very obvious, like, Superman and all of this stuff is kind of out there. I'm not saying Superman is already Superman. However, given the fact that Matt Reeves has included that there are Halloween costumes on Halloween at that part of the movie where people are dressed up like Wonder Woman, Superman, I believe these heroes might already be out there. It might not be referenced to a whole bunch. There's even a part in the newspaper where a blur saved a bus full of kids. So I believe they're out there. Bruce might even know of this, but it's just like, this is a story about the Batman. The Justice League may be down the line 6 years from now, or maybe even longer. But you see what I mean? It's going to be very ambiguously set up that way. It doesn't need to be deliberately set up, because Matt Reeves probably isn't going to ever pertain to that, these other characters. But it's subtle world building. That's all I would ever bank on with regards to Matt Reeves. I know this is a bit of a tangent, but with regards to Matt Reeves addressing the larger characters in this universe. Metropolis is out there, Lex Corp and all that stuff. Lex is out there. But it would just be subtly Easter egged rather than, hey, yeah, Superman flies into Gotham in the third movie. I doubt it. But doesn't mean he's not out there. That was all around 25 years old for Bruce. Now, in the epilogue, it says a couple of years later, which makes sense because Batman Year One was around the time that we were discussing, but now, obviously, a couple years later, it pertains to where this movie is set, you know, in Batman Year Two. So it's all really nicely adding up here. It says, on a rainy Halloween night, Bruce prowled the streets in his drifter mode, literally what he does, and we're going to see that in the movie, as we all know. And his wandering was a part of a carefully planned routine, but now, like, this is 2 years in from the suit of armor man with the bat ears that we were covering with the jewelry store heist with the Arkham-like explosive gel. And this is where he wrote down in like that Gotham Project journal, Year 2, a second year of nights has turned me into a nocturnal animal. My senses are heightened now. I can almost smell them. Them meant criminals. Gotham City was full of them, but they don't know where I am. In a dim alley, Bruce opened his backpack and pulled out a tube of black camouflage paint and smeared it around his eyes. Reached into the bag for a black hood with long pointed ears. Now, again, earlier I could have mixed up the hood for meaning, like maybe they just mean cowl, because hood with ears could just mean cowl rather than like a proto bat suit with a hood with ears going through it. I'm pretty sure it is and has been the cowl this whole time. He just wasn't necessarily called Batman. But anyway, it ends by saying, on a roof of an abandoned half-built skyscraper downtown, a rusted searchlight shot its beam into the rainy night sky. Attached to the center of its lens is a dark shape. A metal bat with its wings outstretched. A signal for now for when I need it. But when that light hits the sky, it's not just a call, it's a warning to them. And this is where it says, by the way, this is very interesting. I am the shadows, I am vengeance, I am ... the Batman. Now, I don't know if that's just for the book purposes, but again, some people still ask me, like, is he called the Batman, or how do you think he would get that name? He's clearly got a bat symbol, as we already know that, but like to the larger point, there are newspapers that call this Batman seen across the skies. Sometimes, yes, they call him Vigilante, or a Vigilante, and people call him Vengeance, likely after the Goon records that fight. But the larger question we're really asking here is, does he refer to himself as Batman? Because here it says, I am Shadows, I am Vengeance, I am the Batman. Like, that was him saying that, like, as the last line of the book. Now, he knows that he is a guy dressed as a bat. He knows he's being referred to as Batman in some newspapers. But he also says, I'm Vengeance in the trailer. But, technically speaking, we didn't see the continuation of that scene. He could have said, like, I'm Vengeance, I am the Shadows, I am Batman. That might be too cheesy for some, despite it being a very somewhat similar line to a Kevin Conroy kind of line. But I don't know. I do want to add into the count that even though the fact that this is a prequel story that is legitimate for what we know Bruce went through leading up to the events of the movie, it still does have some aspects of, well, maybe he doesn't call himself Batman, even though he is a Batman. He might actually just refer to himself as Vengeance until he finally accepts, after everyone's calling him a Batman, that he is Batman. Like, he'll be like, okay, yeah, I am Vengeance, but I'm also Batman, since everyone knows me as Batman. I dress like a bat, for crying out loud, and have a bat signal and a bat emblem on my chest. But I do also want to entertain the fact that maybe it is likely that he says he's Vengeance, but he also says the other lines, like, I am the Shadows and I am the Batman. But again, that might come across a little bit cheesy if delivered. That's why he might just say, for simplicity's sake, Matt Reeves might have just said in that fight scene with the goons in the trailer, I'm Vengeance. But he also does acknowledge that he is also known as Batman as well. But again, in this book, they phrase it as if he, like, calls himself, you know, I am the Shadows, I am Vengeance, I am the Batman. I don't know if that is technically strictly accurate. Similar to the Arkham Asylum thing when it's really Arkham State Hospital. I technically don't know if it's strictly accurate to what Bruce Wayne calls himself in Batman Year 2 as we're watching the movie. Even though, as I want to repeat one more time, newspapers like the Gotham Gazette have literally referred to him as the Batman, or a Batman, as you're seeing on screen. But that is this video, guys. I know this was a long one. I wanted to do a deep dive because, A, I wanted to go through and recap the book, but also just give you my unfiltered thoughts and impressions on how this impacts the Bruce and the characters and Edward Nashton of what we see in the movie, or what we will see in the movie, that is. So I don't expect you guys to remember every single thing I said, but obviously, as I always say, I would love to know what you thought of A, the book, and all of the things we discussed, the main points that we, you know, took out of the book, but also what you thought of my thoughts on each main point. Now, obviously, as I just said, you're probably not going to remember each main point, but just let me know everything, ultimately, the takeaways from the book, what you thought about what I had to say about some of my takeaways, maybe question some of the things that I was questioning, because there was a few moments where I was like, I don't know about this one, like, does this mean this? But either way, guys, if you got to this point, holy crap, this is more relevant than ever. If you got to this point, only put this, I know some of you might skip and put this anyway, but only do this if you have got to this point. Leave the hashtag, along with whatever comment you're going to leave down in the comments below, hashtag Bruce Jitsu, because, you know, it's relevant to the book, I suppose. And I'm going to end this video here. Been going on way too long as it is, so it's going to be a long edit, a long upload. Maybe you watched this in a couple different parts. If you did, as always, I appreciate a like. That is insanely helpful, especially for a video this long. It might not do so well because it's really, really long, and it's only for, like, I guess the niche fans. We'll have to wait and see. Subscribe. I mean, geez, if you've got this far, subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, as always, I get a lot of comments saying people have been watching me recommended on their YouTube, but you haven't actually subscribed. So check if the red button's actually been clicked to change from subscribed to subscribed. That'd be really helpful. We're also closing in very close on 100,000 subscribers now. But I'm going to love you and leave you, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you, Bat Family, in the next video. Goodbye.